Picture this. 1907. The motor car isn't your trusty family estate with air conditioning and sat-nav. It's basically wooden wheels, leather brakes, a Conneroll from the chemists, a can of oil in the boot, acetylene headlamps, magneto ignition, and less power than a modern lawnmower. Beijing to Paris, absolute madness. It all began with journalistic mischief. On the 31st of January 1907, the Parisian newspaper Le Matin published an article taking the mickey out of circular motor racing. Journalist Julie down the gauntlet. Would anyone dare drive from Beijing to Paris by motor car? She probably hadn't the foggiest idea where Beijing actually was. Neither did the 100,000 readers who could chuckle at this charming notion. But whilst everyone was having a laugh, the very next day a telegram arrived at the editorial office from the Marquis de Dion. Challenge accepted. Hot on his heels came a proper adventurer, an Italian prince. 35 years old, aristocratic, sporting a facial scar, a collection of broken bones, and a sewn back on nose courtesy of some rather spirited horses. Always surrounded by women, danger, and adrenaline, miss such an adventure, not bloody likely. The organizers quickly grasped the sheer scale of lunacy involved. Roads didn't exist, proper maps were non-existent. Route? What route? Drive however you fancy. Just get from Beijing to Paris. Rules? No rules whatsoever. Prizes? A bottle of champagne. And the entire journey at your own expense, naturally. Unsurprisingly, as the start date approached, participants began dropping out in droves. To difficulties appear enormous upon careful consideration, delicately observed the more sensible motorists. By April 1907, only 5 crews of genuine nutters remained. And then erupted the great debate. Power versus lightness. De Dion and his supporters backed lightweight machines to 8 to 10 horsepower, reasoning they wouldn't get bogged down in mud and would be easier to extract. Monsieur Pons took this theory to ridiculous extremes, choosing a 3-wheeled tricontal with a measly 6 horsepower, a spidery contraption that looked more like a bicycle with an engine bolted on. Prince Borghese, however, thought differently. He commissioned an Edelov from Turin with an unprecedented 40 horsepower. If a machine has sufficient power, it'll tackle any road, even when heavy, reasoned the prince. Godard in his Spyker chose the middle ground -15 horsepower. On the 14th of April 1907, 5 motor cars lined up at the start in Beijing. Ahead lay 16,000 kilometers through deserts, mountains, swamps, and steppes. No roads, no maps, no rules, just iron will, mechanical wizardry, and boundless faith that the motor car could conquer anything. This wasn't a race. This was proof that man and machine could reach anywhere, even if that machine resembled a wheeled torture device rather than a proper means of transport. The greatest motoring adventure in history had begun. From the very first days, the drivers grasped the magnitude of the challenge before them. There were no roads, only caravan trails. The automobiles became mired in sand and broke down on the rocks. For a few coins, Chinese peasants would spend hours pushing the 2-ton vehicles. Each day brought fresh breakdowns. There were no spare parts. They repaired with makeshift materials, said their prayers, and pressed on. In the mountains, there were no bridges spanning the gorges, nor roads crossing the passes. The route was impossibly steep and strewn with boulders. The road consisted of deep ruts carved by centuries of caravans, designed only for the passage of horses, camels, and mules, with the occasional wagon. Motor vehicles could not possibly traverse the mountains under their own power. Muscle and tackle were essential, as the machines had to be pushed and hauled at every turn, and in some places literally carried by hand. Rain poured ceaselessly from the sky. The travelers' automobiles were accompanied by mules and porters, assisted by soldiers. Yet still the Asian stretch of the route became a nightmare for all. Streams swelled into rivers, and even horses struggled along the sodden earth and mountain paths. The machines were dragged by ropes, carried by hand, pushed, rolled out of mud, unloaded before every ascent, the engines being so feeble, then loaded once again. They covered 30 to 40 kilometers per day. Rocky trails were widened with crowbars, rafts for river crossings were hastily assembled from native dwellings, and the automobiles were ferried across waterways in pieces. Planks, logs, and stones were laid beneath the wheels. The expedition stubbornly pressed northwest toward Russia. The first car to be encountered by a grim hum over Russia in the early morning was Borghese's Edella. The other participants had fallen a full 3 days behind. It was then that the brave Europeans realized the real difficulties had not even begun. There were no roads, the bridges could barely support horses. When the very first bridge collapsed under the Edella, the prince remarked wryly, "Excellent, now we won't have to worry about the way back." When traveling along the Taiga Trail became simply impossible, Borghese directed his Edella onto the rails of the Trans-Siberian Railway. On one occasion, the car became wedged between the railroad ties, and the crew heroically managed to literally yank the machine out from under an oncoming locomotive. The racers drove for 30 hours straight without a break, slept for 2 or 3 hours at a time. Blood streamed from their palms, and their eyes could no longer see anything. Tow ropes and cables snapped like threads, chassis convulsed on Russian potholes, logs cracked, Siberian nets devoured the European aristocracy without ceremony. Cars sank and tumbled from makeshift bridges, became so hopelessly stuck that even these travelers who had weathered China's great rains, Asian cliffs, ravines, and salt flats found themselves on the brink of despair. In the end, for underpowered and overloaded automobiles and 10 men of iron, conquered the worst roads that the wild places of the world could offer, the worst weather, the solitude of empty lands, and the suspicion or hostility of local inhabitants. The experts had said it was impossible, because nothing like it had ever been attempted before. The men and machines proved them wrong. On August 10th, Borghese was the first to cross the finish line in Paris, arriving 2 weeks ahead of the other race participants. The Italian automobile had successfully completed the 16,000-kilometer journey in 60 days. The Spyker finished second. In Siberia, it encountered problems with its magneto, which was only repaired thanks to the assistance of students from the Tomsk Polytechnic Institute. Subsequently, the rear axle broke down, and the team had to wait more than a week for a replacement to be shipped by railway from the factory. The French Dion-Bouton came in third. The Contal tricycle dropped out of the race, was still in Mongolia and was left forever in the Gobi Desert.